We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Twisted Delphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Cinia. Today we'll be talking about one of the most significant figures in Christadelphian history, Mr. Robert Roberts. Many of us are familiar with him by name, at least, as his books were frequently mentioned at the podium by the brethren at different ecclesias. If you know a little bit about his history, then you might know him as the person who organized the Christadelphians into an organization. He helped create the structure for ecclesias, ran the magazine that provided guidance for members, and he set an example for how issues in the ecclesia should be handled. He was also known as a prolific writer and was both the first editor of the Christadelphian magazine and also wrote and published mountains of Christadelphian literature throughout his lifetime. So those are the things that you might have learned as a Christadelphian. You know me, though, and I want to look beyond the facts that we were taught, and I want to have some fun. So I want to examine Robert Roberts in a different way. And I also really want to look into who he was. Let's ask questions like, when and why did he become a Christadelphian? Why did he pour his life and livelihood into this new religious group at the time? And as I pointed out in our history episode about John Thomas, what was Robert's relationship like with Dr. Thomas? And why was Robert Roberts so obsessed with this man who really seems to have been his polar opposite in many ways? In this episode, I also want to highlight the humanity of Robert Roberts. I want him to feel like a real guy to you, instead of just this mythical Christadelphian writer. And I think by doing that, we can make a little more sense of his involvement with Dr. Thomas and the Christadelphians. I also think Roberts is the perfect example of the psychology of being a member of a group, especially a religious group like this. So it's kind of an important example to know about if you ever choose to engage in some critical thinking on whether the group displays attributes of a cult or high-control religious group. In general, I think anyone who is a member would relate more to Robert Roberts than John Thomas. So there's some interesting stuff that we'll talk about to reflect on. And I'm going to share all the really interesting stuff. There's a few times that I literally screamed out loud while learning about him. So I hope that you enjoy this absolutely chaotic episode as much as I enjoyed working on it for you. Definitely listen till the end, because the end has a lot of the fun tidbits. So I hope you'll come along for this ride with me back to the 1800s as we learn about Robert Roberts. Well, I've already pointed out that Dr. Thomas is a lawyer in our John Thomas episode and true crime episodes. Robert Roberts was really a hard-working man of integrity. Unfortunately, Robert Roberts is also the least fun man I have ever learned about at this point. Despite the fact that he had numerous run-ins with the police, he made some pretty strange decisions in his life, and his official biography was sadly written by the meanest biographer I've ever read. So I'll start with some biographical information and explain how Roberts came to be involved with the group that would ultimately become the Christadelphians. And before we dive further into some controversy about him, and then the 3 crazy things about Robert Roberts that I cannot believe are true. Today, many of the quotes provided will be taken from Robert Roberts' autobiography called My Days and My Ways, and from the biography of Robert Roberts written by Islip Collier, aka the meanest biographer ever, entitled Robert Roberts, A Study of the Life and Character. Other sources referenced will also be available in our show notes. To begin, I'll share a quote from the footnote of Peter Hemingway's book, John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith. Hemingway writes, quote, Robert Roberts was an early follower of Dr. Thomas in Scotland and became the leader of the Christadelphian movement after the death of Dr. Thomas in 1871, unquote. And this is really the most succinct way of summarizing his life and what he made his purpose to be. For anyone paying attention, this comment was written by a Christadelphian, which also indicates that John Thomas was the group's leader and that Roberts then became the leader of the Christadelphians after his death. So for 2 generations, the Christadelphians did have a central authority and a distinct leader. Except Roberts really did not have the charismatic leader part down. So let me share some quotes describing Robert Roberts from his official biography. Collier wrote, quote, "He had some queer little habits, which we cheerfully excused. An irritating, hacking cough when he began to speak. A habit of removing his coat and donning an alpaca jacket just before delivering an address, and of toying with a handkerchief, or perhaps draping it round his neck as a most inadequate shawl when the lecture was over. Robert Roberts was a stout man of vital temperament. He was at the time putting on weight in rather an alarming manner. He reached about 16 stone at his heaviest, and that was too much for a man of his height. Robert Roberts was, in the proper sense of the expression, a very simple-minded man. For that reason, it was easy for unscrupulous and complex-minded men to impose upon him. He comes before the eye of the mind now, after all these years, as distinctly as if he had been seen only yesterday. His portly form, his florid complexion, his red and rather straggling beard and mustache, his dark hair oiled and brushed back from his forehead, most impressive of features, the deep-set, penetrating eyes, so short-sighted that he might pass a friend unrecognized." Unquote. Collier also mentions that Roberts, quote, "used to say that he had a naturally weak voice, and if he shouted, it was only in an effort to overcome the effect." Unquote. And finally, quote, "he was always sincere, but it is not given to man always to be wise." Unquote. Roberts was also known for not enjoying and refusing to partake in or allow fun. On one of his trips by boat, he was invited to join in on a skit that was basically Saturday Night Live that the passengers were putting together to amuse themselves, and Roberts at that time was working a clerical job in a local court. So Collier writes that, quote, "the passengers arranged a mock trial. They wanted Robert Roberts to act as the clerk to the court, but he declined. It was too frivolous amusement, not convenient for a servant of God." Unquote. Even Collier commented later that he didn't quite understand why Roberts couldn't have had even like a little smidgen of fun. But he remarked that, quote, "we must honor him for his consistent refusal to walk in worldly ways." Unquote. And another fact that Collier shared was that Robert Roberts hated novels and wouldn't let his children read them. Collier said that it was a, quote, "complete condemnation of the novel." Unquote. So, I mean, his kids couldn't even read fairy tales, apparently. So, just going through this list, like, is it me or did this author just highlight pretty much every negative attribute that this guy has? Like, this isn't even a biography. It's just a roast at this point of Robert Roberts. And there's one more that's not specifically to Robert Roberts, but I think illustrates kind of like that polite English way of being mean. And so it just is my favorite sentence that the biographer wrote. I just want to throw in here. And it's just the way he was so concise in taking the brethren down a peg. Collier wrote of Christophian exhortations, quote, "there are speakers whose urge for self-expression is an inverse ratio to their ability." Unquote. It's just a polite way of saying the worst speakers won't shut up on the platform. And honestly, I'm sure some of us have seen it. So that's just a little bit about how Robert Roberts was presented. Already a little different than how I was picturing him from the stories I was told that he was this respectable man in the Christadelphians. But he was a real guy, so we're going to talk about him. And since the Christadelphians didn't exist prior to John Thomas, Robert Roberts was unlike most modern Christadelphians in that he was not raised a Christadelphian from birth. However, it was pretty damn close because he lived nearly his entire life under the influence of John Thomas. Robert Roberts actually first heard the doctor speak when he was 11 years old during one of Dr. Thomas's visits to Scotland. Roberts was coincidentally entering a period of religious awakening already as he reached adolescence, but in the 1800s, reaching adolescence basically meant being in adulthood because that's the age when he actually dropped out of school and started working. 11 years old. And to parody Gilmore Girls for just 1 second, Robert Roberts, why did you drop out of school? So a year later, when Robert Roberts was only 12 years old, which would have been about 1851, Roberts left his family's religion for good and converted to follow Dr. Thomas. And this was after he found his sister's copy of the magazine that John Thomas had been publishing called The Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come, which is still yet to come. However, the name Christadelphian hadn't actually been invented yet, so basically he told his parents that he was leaving their very traditional church to go hang out with a few random people who chose to believe whatever this guy living in America believed, and they were going to be submerged in water to save their life. So for the next almost 20 years, Roberts attended, we're going to call it a small meeting with people who called themselves the baptized believers. And to nobody's surprise, his parents weren't thrilled about this. And again, if I was his parent, I would be thinking, this sounds like a cult. And in his autobiography, Roberts wrote that his mother was, quote, grieved and angered beyond measure at the change that had come over me, unquote. And things boiled over when, quote, my absence from chapel would come as a shock and lead to a storm, I feared. It was so, but it did not break at once. When I got home, my mother was sitting over the fire, her chin upon her hands. She did not speak to me, but there was thunder in her face and manner. The day passed in cloud and sultriness. At night, the storm broke. I had got to bed when my mother came and she told me I must attend chapel or leave the house, unquote. So Roberts and his mother had a big fight about him leaving his parents' faith and about his conversion to this new religion. Obviously, it worked out for him in the end, and it was pretty quickly that his mother allowed him to pursue going to this meeting. But this tension between parents and their children actually reminds me of my grandparents, because one of my parents converted to Christadelphianism, and that was when they were a teenager. And they told me that their parents had been upset when they left Catholicism for this small sect of people called the Christadelphians. And there had been fighting and tension for a while, until eventually parents accepted, their kids' new lifestyle and beliefs. So it was kind of funny for me to see this play out for Robert Roberts, because it's kind of timeless, and watching these family dynamics play out as a child changes their religion. So in his autobiography, Robert goes into detail about what that was like as he fell under the influence of the teachings of John Thomas. After reading the magazine with the really long name written by Dr. Thomas, Roberts wrote that he, quote, was awakened, unquote. The timing was also significant, as Roberts wrote that he was, quote, just on the eve of being immersed on Baptist principles when I fell in with the Herald. There was something so rational, so comprehensible, something which partook of so much common sense, that my attention was at once arrested. My curiosity was so much excited that nothing short of an understanding of the whole matter in some way or another would satisfy me, unquote. So the first thing I want to point out with this is that it sounds like Roberts was already kind of primed. He was looking to get more involved in religion. He already knew about Christianity. He wanted to learn more. And as weird as he may have been as a person, he was intelligent and curious and passionate and eager to learn something new. I also thought this was interesting, since John Thomas built Christadelphianism off of Campbellism, and then Campbellism kind of has some roots in Baptist theology, so it feels like it was kind of like a step-by-step path for converts to follow. So I wonder if being Baptist, or almost Baptist as he was about to join but didn't, made it easier for him to follow John Thomas. I don't really know, because I'm not a religious scholar and I don't really want to get into theology, but that was just something I noticed, was just kind of that little family tree. When describing why he was drawn to Dr. Thomas's teachings, Roberts wrote about how he was struck by the way in which the doctor presented his arguments for his beliefs. Roberts wrote, quote, here was a religious book that denied straight away in the first article that there was such a thing as an immortal soul in man at all, and then denounced the whole religious system built upon such an idea as a superstition and an imposture for which the Bible was not responsible. The power of the article lay in its argument. Mere assertion would, of course, have filled me with aversion, but the scriptures were quoted in disproof of the immortality of the soul in a way that literally carried me away, unquote. I grew up Christadelphian, so I can say that this style of teaching is still a signature of the Christadelphians. The brother walks up to the podium, Bible in hand, and stitches together passages of the Bible throughout the exhortation to present a cohesive narrative about the subject of their talk. And they can pick absolutely random verses from anywhere in the Bible, from different authors and different time periods. And then basically they say that they're secretly trying to convey a message, which... So now that I read history, it seems a little odd, considering the original audience didn't even have the full Bible to read. Like, if I only had access to like the first 10, would all of the truths of the Bible be there? Or, supposedly God never changes, despite him having like PMS in the first part of the Bible when he like opened up the ground to swallow up people who didn't do anything wrong. So if I only read those parts, I'd be terrified of the guy. But, Jesus is like, oh, I love you a few thousand years later. So it's interesting that it's kind of all blended like a smoothie into an exhortation. And they're like, here, this is the message of the Bible. I'm like, I think you and Rob Hyman made a comment about reading it as the people of those time periods would have read, which is very different than this style of reading the Bible that Christadelphians do. So I would say that quoting the Bible heavily is such a signature of Christadelphian exhortations that I can still remember one dramatic Sunday when a brother didn't quote the Bible during an exhortation. Only once. And this is a tangent, but I'll keep it brief. Because this brother in my old ecclesia, who has since passed away, became a local legend during my childhood. He was an older brother who sat in the back of the meeting with his little gaggle of older men, and he didn't really give exhortations very often. I think he was kind of at that age where he had like health problems and stuff like that. Wasn't as active as he used to be. So this old man slowly walks up to the podium and he says, "What does love have to do with it? Everything." And then he just walked off the platform and went back to his seat. And everyone just stared at him. And they just started murmuring, "Is it over already? What's going on? What's happening? What happened?" And then the presiding brother just ran over and swooped in and was like, "Okay, I guess now it's time for the breaking of bread and the memorial service." And I just remember for weeks, no one could stop talking about it. And if you've never heard a Christadelphian exhortation, there are hundreds available as podcasts. So feel free to take a listen if you're unfamiliar with their style of speaking, or if you're like really struggling to fall asleep. You'll find some favorites for that. Also, if you want to make it more fun, take a drink every time the brother giving an exhortation reads a quote from the Bible or just mentions Jesus at all, and you've got a drinking game. All right, back on topic. Robert Roberts. Okay. So after reading all of his sister's copies of the magazine written by Dr. Thomas, Roberts decided he couldn't get enough of Dr. Thomas's writings. This literal child pulled money with some other early converts to purchase a copy of Dr. Thomas's first book, Elpis Israel. Roberts wrote in his biography, quote, "When I had completed the perusal of Elpis Israel, my mind was made up. The concurrent reading of the Bible with it had enabled me to arrive at the conclusion, never since disturbed, that popular theology was a hideous caricature of divine truth, and that the system of things contended for by Dr. Thomas was according to a full and correct understanding of the whole scriptures of Moses, the prophets, and the apostles. In this conviction, I resolved to have nothing more to do with church or chapel, but how to give effect to my resolution was a matter of difficulty. I was only 12." Unquote. There's again a lot happening here, but mainly I have no idea how he read that entire book at age 12. Like, as I said, Roberts was a hardworking guy. He was apparently already working at 11 years old. So, like, objectively, he's growing up fast. But, like, full transparency, I've never read Elpis Israel. Just reading the title honestly bores me to tears, let alone trying to read it at 12 years old. I mean, I could read long books at that age. I could read Harry Potter. But it was an interesting book. This is a dense religious work that frequently discusses like Greek and Hebrew etymology. No, thank you. Not for 11-year-old me. And it's really not just me, because even the author, the meanest biographer, Islip, he wrote that, quote, "Some friends who are well acquainted with this work are surprised to hear that a boy of 13 years old could appreciate it. It seems hard going now to some of mature years, and parts of it not at all easy to understand," unquote. And I kind of love this because he like admits he never read it while trying to hide it, where he's like, "Oh, friends who are familiar with it." I'm like, "Oh, you're writing this biography about how he's obsessed with this book and you're not going to read it." Okay. Like, he didn't say like, "Oh, in my experience reading it." But the really weird part, Robert Roberts just wrote about how fascinated he was by this book. In his autobiography, he writes, quote, "I never experienced a purer pleasure than when I commenced with the majestic opening sentences. Revolving upon its own axis and describing an ample circuit through the boundless fields of space is a planet of the solar system, bearing upon its surface a population of nearly 1,000 million subject to sin, disease, and death. I never ceased the reading at my leisure intervals until I got through. I rose early in the morning to have more time, unquote. My theory here is that Robert Roberts never read a novel, because I've seen some pretty amazing first lines of a novel, and this ain't it. Also, I have no interest in reading about sin, disease, and death, so that sounds pretty terrible. So that's probably why I'm not interested in it, and I don't even believe that all those exist. Also, if you're curious about this book, there are copies available online in PDF form for free, so you can try your hand reading it and see if you feel this awe that Robert Roberts experienced and fascination, and if you'll wake up early to read it. I mean, this book solidified his conversion for the rest of his life. He says it was so impactful on him, which is amazing because that seems to be the only person who felt this way reading it. The fact that it's so challenging to read also makes me wonder which of two things was at play here. It seems like either Robert Roberts was extraordinarily intelligent and unusually so for his age, or that he didn't actually understand what he was reading and it just invoked an emotional response that drew him towards it. And no one will ever know for sure. And either way, Roberts quickly made up his mind that Dr. Thomas was intelligent, had figured out the Bible, and that he could be trusted to figuratively take his hand and explain the Bible to him using his books and magazines. Because while Roberts mentioned that he read the Bible in tandem with reading Dr. Thomas's magazines and book, what he was actually doing was reading Dr. Thomas first to get his ideas, then reading the Bible to see that those passages were there. So all of the ideology and the meaning was coming from Dr. Thomas, and everything he was reading was being read to support those interpretations of the Bible. So I would argue this is very much not like the reading the Bible for oneself claim that commonly circulates in Christadelphia, like if you're using these other materials that you're reading first. And again, if these teachings are as obvious as Christadelphians say, then why did Dr. Thomas even need to write a book in the first place? And why couldn't Robert Roberts have just figured out for himself without all these magazines and books? And why was Dr. Thomas's books updated so many times with all those different versions? Anyways, Roberts rapidly changed his life as he became increasingly dedicated to his new faith and also developed a really puritanical view of the world. He eventually moved away from his family to a place called Huddersfield and married a devout woman named Jane, who had been baptized into the same faith in Scotland. And despite slim pickings for a romantic partner in the same religion, they seem to have genuinely loved each other, supported each other, eventually made a family together. Roberts writes all about meeting his wife and shares little stories about her and includes her throughout his autobiography about his life, unlike Dr. Thomas and his poor wife, Ellen. But this new couple was tied together by their deeply devout views, and one of the non-negotiables of their new marriage, which honestly is still kind of the standard in Christadelphia, was weekly attendance at the ecclesia, right? But let me just say, Robert Roberts was lucky that he met someone who could match his freak, because not only did they studiously study their Bibles, but he and his wife Jane would pilgrimage for about 4 hours every Sunday to get to a town 7 miles away that had a small ecclesia, and then walk all the way back to do a 14-mile trek to meeting every Sunday. And yes, for those outside of the US who use the metric system like normal, sensible people, unlike us Americans, they were walking about 22.5 kilometers every Sunday. And since this was a small group of people meeting at that time, and he was well-versed in the Bible, and more importantly, Dr. Thomas's writings, Roberts was also usually giving the exhortation too, and leading the special lectures for the community. So whether he liked it or not, he became a vital part of his ecclesia, and one they did not want to leave. They were actually super mean to him when he and his wife eventually moved away. It kind of sounds like that episode of Goosebumps. You know that TV series when the family moves back into that weird black and white town where no one goes in the sun, and they're kind of like zombie vampire townsfolk, and then the family tries to leave, and they're just screaming, "We need you to stay! You can't leave! We need you!" And that's the visual I have of the ecclesia when the Roberts tried to leave. So now we're going to talk about what Robert Roberts is most famous for. And you really can't talk about him without mentioning it because it's still a backbone of the community. So one attribute that most religious people would probably admire about Roberts is that he basically became an encyclopedia of the Bible. Like, not only was he obsessively reading the Bible once Thomas got him hooked on religion, but he felt he needed to structure his Bible reading. So at age 13, he invented his own method to read the Bible. This would later be named the Bible Companion, and this is the method that is still used by Christadelphians around the world to read their Bible to this day. Roberts wrote in his autobiography that, quote, "To this day, there is no pamphlet in connection with the truth in such steady demand," unquote. As a kid, I didn't even really realize this was like a Christadelphian thing. So for anyone who's not a Christadelphian, I'll just share a few quick facts about it. Most of us know about it as these bookmarks that were given, and there's a column for the month, a column for the day, and then a Bible reading assignment in the last column. And each bookmark is double-sided and has a signed Bible reading for every day of the year. And this was originally designed in a little booklet, but now you pretty much just use these like laminated bookmarks, and it gives you 3 reading assignments from different sections of the Bible to read every day. So if you follow the system, then you read the Old Testament once in its entirety and the New Testament twice in its entirety. It's also structured so you can read the assigned reading while sitting down like once a day. So it's usually less than an hour of reading. Some days you got to power through some really long chapters of the Psalms and stuff. Chapters? I don't know. I'm a heathen. Is that the word? I don't even know. Anyways, every January, Christadelphians around the world will place their bookmarks in their Bibles, Genesis, Psalms, Matthew, and then just start chronologically reading the Bible starting at these 3 points. It is the most common New Year's resolution that you'll hear about in the ecclesia at the end of the year. Like, if you pop in for like a class, you'll hear people talking about like their Bible readings at the end of the year. Everyone starts saying they're committing to being more consistent with the daily Bible readings this year. And everyone will praise them and be like, yeah, that's fantastic. You should. It's also incredible because, like, objectively, it actually works. I've personally read the Bible, like the entire Bible, before using this method. And I think I was about 12 years old, so I'm kind of like giving Robert Roberts a run for his money. One of the side effects of Robert's constant, structured Bible reading is that it gave him a strong familiarity with Bible passages, which he became known for as it began to overtake his ability to converse with people. In his biography, Collier wrote that, quote, "The present writer has never met anyone to compare with Robert Roberts in the apparently spontaneous movement of conversation to the rich fields of Scripture, in the perfectly natural way in which every thought was given a turn in the direction of the great things which dominated his mind," unquote. And Collier wrote that, quote, "Several times in debates, he was able to make a quick reference to original tongues in answering opponents, difficulties which could not have been anticipated, and the surmounting of which clearly indicated knowledge. How is it achieved by one who left school at the age of 11 and went to work?" Unquote. And while Collier is quite eloquent in how he phrases Robert's ability to redirect any conversation to the Bible, it isn't always practical to only be able to converse about the Bible to the detriment of being able to socialize and have any appeal to others. Collier mentioned one non-Christadelphian who remarked of Roberts that he, quote, "was willing to treat his religious convictions with such good-humored toleration. He would have liked to have made the young man unbend a little. He remarked later that Robert Roberts was a good fellow, but his ideas were too narrow," unquote. So because of John Thomas's influence when Robert Roberts was young, impressionable, and seeking religion, Roberts grew up in this Christadelphian fixation on the Bible, which essentially handicapped him in the real world, and outsiders kind of viewed him as this really rigid, moralistic, uptight person. However, his dedication to the Bible and to John Thomas's teachings paved his way to the pivotal role within this new movement. And Roberts was never intending or even claiming to be the successor of John Thomas. He just had the drive and dedication around his faith. If you read his biographies, you'll even read about when a group called the Irvingites were speaking in a town hall. Roberts discovered that there were too many people to fit inside, so many people were standing outside. Seeing a potentially wasted opportunity to preach, he stood in a chair and spoke to the crowd outside of the hall for an hour. Unfortunately for him, as he records in his autobiography, he then, quote, "came to speak of the Pope when the Roman Catholic element of the crowd became uncontrollably turbulent and made a rush towards the speaker, which was resisted for a time by the peaceably disposed of the people, but at last carried all before it and compelled me to dismount. There might have been serious work but for 2 policemen who marched me off between them to the protection of a neighboring hotel, followed by a large crowd. The crowd stayed in front of the hotel and I escaped behind and got quickly home," unquote. Like, I mean, I told you, he was chased by mobs. So he was like kind of like that book smart, but not street smart by any means. And he wasn't the kind of person to like want to read the room. And like if he had wanted to, like he wasn't good if he was trying to manipulate people. I think he was very genuine in his beliefs. But I mean, he's basically parroting everything he had been taught and read by Dr. Thomas, who was the kind of fearless person. However, he also didn't learn his lesson because he signed up to do public lectures and he wrote that he had to escape a crowd by running through a back door again, but another mob chased him after a public lecture. And it was part of a whole lecture series, and Collier wrote about it, saying, quote, "In spite of the police, there was serious mobbing on the way home. Stones were thrown, always a sign that the devil is broken loose," unquote. I thought Christophans don't believe in the devil, so weird comment to make. But yeah, there were living stones thrown at them. And quote, "Still worse things threatened for the last night. It became known that arrangements had been made for an organized riot, and the mayor, becoming alarmed, requested that the last meeting should be canceled," unquote. Robert Roberts was riling up people so much that the town was literally going to riot. The police were at the events, and Roberts was speaking, and they're just trying to keep the peace. And they only canceled when the mayor intervened and told him he had to. But like he had already repeatedly been attacked by angry mobs. And like, all right, well, I guess I gotta try again. It's also kind of no wonder that they thought they were being persecuted as God's chosen people when they were literally being stoned and attacked. I mean, that sounds like something from the Bible. However, if you read what John Thomas wrote about these groups, I mean, he was blatantly insulting them to their faces. So he definitely started it too. So I think this information I provide so far should give you something of an idea of who Robert Roberts was. He was a man who, through his own dedication to his faith, developed a system for others to follow to read their Bibles. A man who was willing to put in as much work and risk as it required physically and mentally to support his local ecclesia. A man who fearlessly preached his religion, even when it came with a risk to his life. However, I do want to pause and take one more look into who he was. I personally believe, based on what is recorded about him, that he was most likely autistic. And I'm actually not the only one, because there's an ex-Christophanian website that I found about him, and they actually reached the same conclusion. So I just want to explain what I noticed that supports that theory, because some of those attributes may relate to his life as a Christophian. So I think anyone familiar with the different presentations of autism will start to see how Roberts was unintentionally described as someone who shows traits that probably would have been characterized a bit of like the old term Asperger's, but that term has since fallen out of favor and is now simply referred to as autism. On the website xchristophians.org, that author's main points were that he had a straightforward, literal way of thinking, seemed to have a hyperfixation on the Bible, and specifically, John Thomas's views on it, that he was extremely naive and gullible despite being incredibly smart, that his social skills were poor, and that he was unable to conform to social expectations of decorum. And I'm not asserting here that everyone with autism would resemble Robert Roberts. It presents differently in every individual. But I do agree. I think that he has some attributes that are common in some people with autism, and I do want to explore that briefly. So to expand on his style of conversing first, I'll point out that it comes up a lot in his biographies, and frequently he mentions wanting intelligent conversation. In one instance, Collier wrote that he, quote, "made several attempts at intelligent conversation, but each time they relapsed into the most stood silence," unquote. And this intelligent conversation line is almost the exact same phrasing that he uses when Roberts speaks to a man at like what was kind of like a health retreat, and again while he was traveling by boat. To Robert Roberts, this intelligent conversation or serious conversation seems to be synonymous with talking about the Bible, which was mentioned earlier as the only thing he really wanted to talk or even think about. Most people who I have met who bring up the same topic over and over again in any conversation on any topic, and that topic is also something that they're more knowledgeable about than the average person, tend to have an autism diagnosis. He really tried to talk to anyone who would listen about the Bible and Dr. Thomas. Collier wrote while he was on his trip that Roberts, quote, "spent most of his time on deck trying to draw into serious conversation the only passenger who appeared to be interested in the word," unquote. All right. So he found someone to talk about the Bible with him and have a serious conversation. But this serious conversation is undercut by the fact that it was taking place on a boat, and it reads like a Monty Python skit. Because Collier wrote that, quote, there was a person with him who the brethren had engaged in some discussion. The argument was now continued on the variable hills of the smooth deck. The parson achieved stability by holding onto a rope, and when the boat rolled badly and the deck became too steep, others, including his opponent, went sliding away from him. Unquote. Like, can't you just picture it? Like, it would be the comedians in Monty Python, and they're all worked up. Like, they're like really like, I need to tell you this. And right as he's about to like shout out a rebuttal, the boat like swings over and then just goes sliding away. And then like, okay, all right, he's coming back. Let's try again. And then right when he's about to talk to him, the other guy goes sliding away. He's like, what did you say? So when he was able to speak to people without them, sliding away from him, he actually got really angry when people wanted to ask his opinion on anything that wasn't related to what he believed were the facts about the Bible. Collier wrote that people from other places would ask him his opinion on politics of the day to make ordinary secular conversation while traveling. As an American, I'm sure people would be asking me these kinds of questions right now too after the most recent election. This outraged him, and, quote, he wished that people would ask him sensible questions, unquote. Like, it seems like his mind was not only thoroughly saturated in the Bible, but it was narrowed to the point where he couldn't even tolerate thinking about or talking about anything else. This may relate to developing black and white thinking as part of his group identity, where he couldn't really think for himself or was so committed to what he believed about the Bible that that was the only thing that mattered. However, I also think it could be an indication of autism, and that he could only think in a way that was logical to him, and he used the Bible to understand the world around him. Also, that he had no patience for small talk. Small talk for autistic people is frequently mentioned as like unanimously hated. And on the other hand, autistic people will say it brings them autistic joy to talk about their hyperfixations with others. And there are instances of Robert's talking about how much joy it brought him to be with others who believe the same thing as him, who fellowshipped with him, who were open to his preaching and hear him speak about his beliefs. His black and white thinking, whether related to autism or simply a side effect of being in a high control group that cultivates that us versus them mindset, also shows up when he talks about what Christadelphians today would call outsiders. Outsiders are individuals who are not members of the Christadelphians, and I'll share 2 examples from Robert's autobiography. In the first example, Roberts wrote that he and his wife attended a tea with some phrenologists. Phrenology is something you can Google if you want to learn about how pseudoscientists were racist in the 1800s by measuring people's heads. Roberts worked for these phrenologists at one time, and in his book he records hanging out with them. Since they weren't baptized believers like him, here's how he wrote about that day. Quote, the tea meeting took place in an open air at the Arboretum, and would have been a very pleasant affair had it been on the basis of enlightenment towards God and submission to his appointment. But as a mere festival of the flesh, it was not far from being nauseous, glorifying man who is not worthy of it, and deifying a science that merely shows us man's dark interior, unquote. Whew, Robert Roberts. How rude of them to invite you to this lovely party in a garden. It's so hard to relax in a beautiful garden with your wife. How bad that you feel nauseous that other people don't want to talk about submission to God with you. Like, I'll be honest, when I host a party, submission to God has never come up. In fact, there may be some people who are interested in submission in other circumstances, and I think Robert Roberts would actually throw up if he heard those conversations. The other example Roberts wrote about when he records that, quote, friendship thin-offs infallibly when fundamental principles are not mutually shared, especially when the element of duty to God comes in on one side or the other, unquote. So he basically felt that it was a non-negotiable in his friendships, that they must feel obligated to God or he can't be their friend, which I still honestly kind of see on Christadelphians who look down on and cut ties with anyone who doesn't believe in Christadelphian teachings. And since he helped shape Christadelphian culture, it's interesting to see him thinking this way and teaching others this mindset, but maybe that's, more common. But it's, it was there from the start. However, it turns out that the feeling of the friendship not working was mutual. The potential friends being referenced felt that, quote, they would not consent to intercourse on the basis of being tolerated as respectable heathens. They demanded silence on that topic, to which we could not consent, unquote. First off, I love the term respectable heathens. I want to co-opt it for this podcast. I like it. And secondly, that sounds like pretty damn healthy boundaries to me. Roberts is insulting them. He's criticizing them, telling them to submit to the Lords. And then they're just like, let's find common ground and talk about something else. And he's like, no, I refuse. And then just like doesn't see any problem with insulting them for not believing what he believes. Like, I hope they dropped him. And then his response is vaguely threatening and ominous. Roberts writes that, quote, there will be a straightening out of matters when the Lord shows his arm again in the reappearing of Christ, unquote. Like, besides being bizarre, like, that's just so creepy. And his potential friends are like, hey, that's really rude of you to call us respectable heathens. Can you just, like, please not talk about your religion with us and, like, we can try to be friends? And Robert's like, no, Jesus thinks you're heathens and I'll be proven right when he returns to kill you. Also, it's your fault we're not friends now, heathens. So it's interesting that he chose to write about this story in his autobiography because I think it paints him in a very poor light of disrespecting other people. But it tells us a little bit about how inflexible he was with his religious beliefs and a very interesting example of his social skills. And with the social skills, it gets a teeny bit blurry because the Christadelphians are a high control group. And this story in particular is a little bit relatable because I've been that respectable or not so respectable heathen personally. Like, after years of poor treatment, I politely asked a Christadelphian who was being very hostile, very demanding every time I saw them about just trying to get me to be a Christadelphian to please stop bringing it up to me. It was happening regularly, and it was incredibly stressful for me to always be attacked and criticized and to be made to feel bad and unwelcome and like I wasn't good enough when I was around them. This person had no interest in my reasons for not being Christadelphian, no interest in getting to know who I am, and there was no room to meet in the middle or be friendly while accepting our differences, just like Robert Roberts and his respectable heathens. I was calm, said please, and I thought it was a pretty reasonable request to set like a healthy boundary to not continually have an argument about religion. But this person really seemed intent on bullying me into converting to their religion, and I knew that there was no way in hell that was going to happen. And so the conversation ended pretty quickly because they told me to, quote, get the hell off my property, unquote, after I made my request. So I set a boundary and I had to stop seeing that person regularly because they refused to accept that. And they refused to show respect to me and instead insisted that I tolerated being treated like that or convert to their abusive religion to, make the abuse stop. And I personally don't feel like that's a great option. So amazingly, the relationship kind of soured. And so it's just that this stubbornness and aggression isn't restricted to just Robert Roberts. But since he was a pioneer in the group, he may have contributed to this mindset about how Christadelphians should treat and judge non-Christadelphians. And there are probably some other ex-Christadelphians who have been in similar situations as I was, and maybe we'll hear about some of those on the interview episodes of this podcast. I also noticed a few other things during my reading, getting back to the autism a little more. I already brought up his bizarre intelligence at a young age because he was reading way above his age level, which can relate to some presentations of autism. Autism is also characterized by sensory sensitivities. And I was reminded of this when Collier recorded that Roberts was unable to sleep when there's a loud ticking clock was in his room. So he was staying in a Christadelphian home one night, and after he left, they were like, hey, our clock is missing. And they couldn't find it until winter came. And, quote, they discovered it wrapped up and hidden in the bottom of a drawer of heavy clothes, unquote. Clearly, he had intended to muffle the sound so he could sleep. And then presumably he had that really classic neurodivergent experience of forgetting an object exists when you don't see it. And so he left without putting it back where it was. Roberts also avoided eye contact. Collier wrote that, quote, he was very easily disturbed. And although he often shut his eyes while speaking, any element of distraction seemed to scatter his thoughts and render his work difficult, if not impossible, unquote. So it makes me think of autism in the description of him closing his eyes, and maybe even ADHD, which commonly co-occurs with autism because of this inability to focus. Again, a theory. His understanding of social cues was also unusual. Throughout the book, Collier mentions that Roberts would like shine people's shoes all the time. And it wasn't to be like humble or Christ-like. It was just he thought that this was like really good exercise to keep him healthy and he was gaining weight. So he just kept doing this despite like his age and status. There was also a story about how he was speaking at a dinner party when he drank the water in a bowl in front of him. The problem was that bowl was meant to be used to wash his hands. So this was kind of seen as like a silly mistake. But then he grabbed his neighbor's like dirty water finger bowl and guzzled that down, to which everyone was kind of horrified. And while it seems like he was a little bit careless about what he put in his mouth, he, quote, did not take wine, unquote, and complained that he stuck out in America where he, quote, thought if he had been a drinker of alcoholic liquors, he would have been better treated, unquote. And not being a drinker is not, autistic. But I do think it illustrates his strong sense of good and bad, his values, and his inability to be flexible when social convention would have been in his favor if he put aside his beliefs to follow the crowd to gain acceptance. Despite Roberts, again, being the least fun Christadelphian I've researched, other people did see some humor in him and his lack of conformity to social norms regarding decorum and personal care. Collier wrote that Roberts, quote, might arrive home rather dirty and disheveled, having given a somewhat too realistic description of Daniel in the lion's den, in which he had played the part of man and lions. He was almost devoid of dignity, as it is usually understood in the world, unquote. Oh, Collier, this roast. His long, disheveled hair also made him the butt of a joke during his travels. Collier records that on one trip, quote, an announcement of the lecture was fixed. A humorist had put a notice that after the lecture, a collection would be taken to enable Mr. Roberts to get his hair cut. This was amusing to those who remember the long, dark hair, normally oiled and brushed back from his forehead, and sometimes losing its austerity and becoming rather wild, unquote. For a man who was so serious in his studies, he made some choices that raised eyebrows in his community for not caring about his appearance, as society would expect of a man of his age and status, both in how he behaved and in how he chose to present himself to the world. Okay. Now, there's one last characteristic of Robert Roberts that I want to explore related to him possibly, potentially having autism. And this characteristic that Robert has overlaps with the common presentation is gullibility and being naive. And I think this is important to discuss since those attributes can significantly increase your risk of ending up in abusive relationships or even cults and high control groups. We already know he's super smart. He's diligent. He's hardworking. That makes him a good target for a cult. But on the flip side, does he have the skills to avoid being drawn into a cult or being able to spot someone who wants to take advantage of him? Whether you think he had autistic attributes or not, that's fine if you don't think that's there. That's fine. But I do think there's a pretty widely cast net of examples for this theory, and his gullibility was a major detriment in his life. In a future episode, I will tell you about how this led to major humiliations for himself and other Christadelphians who were associated with him later in his life. Like, it's a major thing in his life. But if we rewind back, let's remember how young he was when he was first exposed to Dr. Thomas. He was 11 years old when he first heard John Thomas speak, 12 years old when he decided to dedicate his life to this religion after reading Elpis Israel, and it's said that he was 14 when he officially joined and became a brother. I personally have reservations about any religion, not just the Christadelphians, but I would include them, who prey on children to join their religions to bolster their numbers. Like, I consider his young age as something that made him more vulnerable to unwittingly joining a high control group. But Collier mentions that Roberts was extremely gullible when he writes that, quote, he never revealed much understanding of human nature and was a poor judge of individual character. Any scoundrel who pretended to be interested in the Bible could deceive him, unquote. So I guess the question now is, if you believe Dr. Thomas was a scoundrel or not. We have a young man here who possibly has a disability, who is incredibly gullible, being encouraged to convert to a new religion and send the man in charge some money. And yes, Robert Roberts did send John Thomas money. Doesn't that begin to raise some concerns about his early conversion into Christadelphianism? This becomes a much darker story When you begin to look at Robert Roberts as a young person who was susceptible to indoctrination which took over his life, rather than just as a passionate, intelligent man who gained status among this small community as he's typically portrayed. For someone who is not a Christadelphian and does not revere John Thomas, this can lead us to consider, was John Thomas just a scoundrel who deceived Robert Roberts using the Bible? And whether or not you believe his teachings, we've seen that Dr. Thomas's character was pretty suspect in his actions and was, putting it mildly, self-absorbed. There will also be future episodes diving into some ugly truths about John Thomas, so stay tuned for that. To me, I almost see John Thomas as someone like the other mother in Coraline who ate up the lives of the stolen children. This other mother manipulated the children, tricked them, and then took their lives. I actually think that Robert Roberts could be considered a victim who had so much potential joy stripped from his life because of his devotion to Dr. Thomas. I'm going to explain why by the end. But for now, let's dive into his relationship with Dr. John Thomas. And then I get to tell you all the strange, funny, and bizarre things I uncovered about their relationship. And I can't wait. All right. John Thomas will now enter the chat. Well, Christadelphians insist that anyone who reads the Bible will come to the same conclusions as them. It's worth looping back to the fact that it was an independent Bible study that convinced Robert Roberts to get baptized and join an ecclesia. It was John Bad Boy Thomas. Okay, I made that nickname up, but yeah, John Thomas. We already mentioned this earlier in the episode, but in his autobiography, Roberts describes exactly how his conversion began. He said, quote, "I came across a copy of the Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come, which was being published monthly by Dr. Thomas. I had never heard of it before that I know of. The one thing I perceived was that it was a religious magazine, and that in my state of mind, I withdrew it from its place with a feeling of satisfaction and sat down to read. The experience was extraordinary," unquote. This magazine was essential to Dr. Thomas in order to spread the word of his views, gain followers to his religion, and keep them informed as he continued to travel. Roberts was really the perfect example of how this played out in an ideal situation. Someone who vaguely believes in Christianity and the authority of the Bible, but isn't really certain about the specifics of what they believe, or is in that period of soul searching. And then they're exposed to his ideas. Collier even points this out when he writes that Roberts, quote, "had not been interested in the Bible, although as a matter of tradition, he recognized it as the foundation of Christian teaching," unquote. Tradition. And again, that just assumption that the Bible is correct and that he should believe in it. Thomas found his niche, just convincing people who already believed in the Bible, but who were really uneducated about its contents, and who would just listen to his exposition and believe that he had unraveled the mysteries of its message for humanity. I could see a few reasons why Roberts was swayed by the Doctor and abandoned the other religions he had associated with. The Doctor's manner of teaching would appeal to his sense of logic and reason, because he does use those Bible verses to argue for his interpretation, and then the reader can go find those references in the Bible. His reference to these passages also indicates that kind of familiarity and knowledge that shows that the Doctor is an expert. The final attribute that I would suspect impressed Roberts was that Thomas had the added authority of Doctor. Despite the Herald being a religious magazine, he always signed his name as Dr. John Thomas or John Thomas, MD. And regardless of whatever impressed Roberts about these new teachings, it's interesting that it was only after Roberts' foray into the writings of Dr. Thomas that Roberts, quote, "became a voracious and even excited reader of it and the Bible," unquote. Yeah, I'm reading the magazine first. It was just a side effect of reading Dr. Thomas's magazines that people became interested in the Bible. And those new teachings would instruct people how to understand what they were reading and appeal to their ego a little bit. Oh, yeah, you're studying the Bible when you review it after reading the magazine. Yeah. This emphasis on the individual as a Bible student, rather than that more common relationship of this religious leader figure reading the Bible and imparting the lessons of the Bible to the congregation, did appeal to people, and it highlighted a contrast between these converts and a lot of people in mainstream religions. So there was an appeal to their ego, and it made it feel democratic and accessible. Roberts wrote that, quote, "The effect of Dr. Thomas's writings while causing me to lose all taste for the religious literature, which had been for 6 months been my sustenance, was to impart a keen interest in the Bible, which before had been uninteresting to me, and to lead to its daily and early reading, unquote. So yes, he was reading the Bible, but it was only as a result of reading the writings of John Thomas and his confirmation bias looking for evidence to assure him that Dr. Thomas was correct. I also love that Robert Roberts admitted the Bible was uninteresting. Boom. Roberts was fearless in sharing his beliefs because he truly believed that he had found the truth, and he would debate people about it. Being part of this group meant that he now felt smarter, and I would add more self-righteous than other people, or as Leah pointed out, just better than people. What he seemed to like about this new religion the longer he stayed in it was that the Bible was truly treated like a weapon, and John Thomas was the one teaching him how to wield it against others. It must have been really validating to be this uneducated man who didn't finish school, who was now able to illustrate more knowledge about the Bible than most people. Christadelphians back then were also way more outspoken than I've known them to be in the present day, and he was just challenging people to debates. As I mentioned before, but this was before he met his wife, Roberts joined a local ecclesia. It met in various incredibly random places, such as a barber shop bathroom and a bakery in those early days before the group had really organized itself into what we would now recognize as an ecclesia. And despite the very unusual meeting locations, Robert wrote the quote, "My satisfaction in attending was derived from the great and glorious things I had learned from Dr. Thomas's writings, with which this insignificant assembly was associated in my mind," unquote. All right, so maybe he can throw a little bit of that mean around. So while he considered the group of believers that he belonged to as insignificant, it's worth pointing out that he did not feel that way about John Thomas. Did you notice that he just said his satisfaction was about Dr. Thomas's writings and not with the Bible? Here's a really fun fact. Early converts to what would become the Christadelphians didn't actually read and study the Bible together when they met. Yeah, they had meetings and they didn't read the Bible. So what do you think they were doing in the barbershop bathroom? And don't you make it weird. I know it's weird, but come on. I'm sure his mother wanted to know why her teen was meeting strangers in the bathroom, but okay, I'm going to tell you what they were doing. They were reading the writings of John Thomas. Yeah, not the Bible, what John Thomas wrote. So Roberts describes one such evening when he writes, quote, "The principal feature of interest to us during our Birmingham stay was our Sunday intercourse with a handful of people who had been interested in Dr. Thomas's visit and lectures in 1849, and of whose existence we learned from occasional hints in the Herald of the Kingdom and otherwise. They were not organized as a church or even an ecclesia, but met together in a very informal way on Sunday evenings in the upper bathroom of a barber shop in Summer Lane, to read Dr. Thomas's writings," unquote. Man, I really have some sympathy for Robert Roberts' mom here, because if I had a kid take off to go hang out with some people with no name, no structure, sit in a bathroom in a barber shop, reading a magazine from some random guy from a different country, all about religion, I would be more than a little concerned. Like, what direction is your life going from here? This story could have had a very different ending. And while it seems to have been fairly typical for all of Thomas's converts to read his magazine more than his Bible, Roberts wrote that, quote, "The regular receipt of the Herald every month was a great educator to me, in conjunction with the daily reading of the scriptures. My mind opened on a great variety of subjects, and I felt much drawn to the editor of the magazine," unquote. So it wasn't just the writing that was having an effect on him. It was the larger-than-life energy of Dr. Thomas. And no, I personally don't think it was a romantic relationship, but I'll admit they have a dynamic which would be very, very, very easy to adapt into like this bisexual fanfic. Like, I get why, but I personally don't believe it. And, I do believe Roberts genuinely loved his wife, Jane. I don't know. I don't think so. If anyone has a resource, let me know. I don't think so. change my mind if you want, but I don't think so. So we're already seeing that based on Robert's recounting of his life, Roberts wouldn't have developed his views without having read the publications of Dr. Thomas. In his biography, Roberts writes that, quote, "I therefore procured a copy of Elpis Israel and read it with intense interest," unquote. Like, it was really John Thomas who was drawing Roberts deeper and deeper in the group as he became more fixated on learning more about him, learning more about what he believed, and he became very reverent of Thomas. When Roberts was a teen, that was when he reached out to him for the first time. He wrote him a letter encouraging John Thomas to visit Britain. However, the doctor had a policy that he would only travel if his expenses were covered. Roberts was unable to cover his expenses, but he just sent the money anyway. And unsurprisingly, Dr. Thomas was really, kind of happy to be randomly sent money by a convert who just was obsessed with him. So after sending this letter to John Thomas, quote, "Here was a youth in Great Britain who could write, who was full of enthusiasm for the scriptures, and who at such an early age could stand for principle against parents and friends. His development was to be observed with keen interest," unquote. Am I the only one who finds this creepy? Yeah. But I mean, at the same time, he had a good point. The doctor spread his message through writing, and he could use support from someone like Roberts who could articulate his ideas in writing, who was fearlessly promoting them to the point of being stoned, and who had made his devotion to Thomas's beliefs his mission and defining purpose in life. He was clearly willing to make sacrifices and send, his own money as well as other members who were there to him. And I mean this seriously, but John Thomas was to Robert Roberts what a Swiftie is to Taylor Swift. Like when Robert Roberts heard that Dr. Thomas was considering coming to Europe for a preaching tour, coincidentally escaping the Civil War conflict in America, Roberts wrote that, quote, "Dear Brother Thomas, I have just heard that you contemplate paying a visit to this country, and I write this hasty line to urge you to by all means come. The prospect has filled us with great joy. We can conceive of no event in this mortal life of ours that would give us so much real, unmingled delight," unquote. Like, Roberts was obsessed with him. He was like a teenage girl at a One Direction show. No event in his life could compare with this old man coming to visit him and yell at him about the Bible. Not his marriage, not the birth of his multiple children, not the beauty of nature that God created. Just seeing this man that he had never met. Like, this should be a pretty big clue that Roberts did not have a normal opinion of Dr. Thomas. Roberts was Dr. Thomas's fan. And if you read Christadelphian history, you'll see that fangirl mode is just the normal way that Roberts talks about John Thomas. Like, Robert describes him with unrestrained adoration and unbridled obsession. Eventually, John Thomas actually did agree to visit, and he left America when the chaos of the Civil War escalated. Once Thomas arrived on his trip to stay with Roberts for the first time, Roberts wrote, quote, "Never have I listened with such greedy attention to human utterances as I did when Dr. Thomas rose, in compliance with the invitation, to address the feeble company assembled. The first of all read the beginning of the 17th chapter of Genesis. The reading was itself a treat unutterable. It was not merely that the enunciation was melodious and clear, but there was an inflection and emphasis which of itself seemed to convey the whole sense of the word without comment. To hear Dr. Thomas read a chapter was of itself as good as a lecture. What the doctor said after the reading has now, passed from my mind, but I felt entranced. This was not due to rhetoric, for, strictly speaking, the doctor had none. His style of discourse was plain and earnest, and by current standards would be considered commonplace. It was the matter that was powerful. I was in complete sympathy with all that was written in the scriptures, and to hear these scriptures read and made to speak in such a capable and confident way made me feel almost in the presence of these sublime realities themselves," unquote. I mean, I feel a little bad that the audience was feeble. Man, he always throws his own people under the bus, but obviously he was obsessed with the doctor. I also find it very interesting that Roberts couldn't actually remember what John Thomas said. it almost sounds like he was in a trance. He was like listening to the sounds, but like not the content of what was happening. Like, I think John Thomas could have said absolutely anything. And Robert Roberts would have been like, oh, that's the best, like, and just praised him. It wasn't about his wit or about his analysis, but it was about a man who, despite denying being a prophet, was clearly not seen that way by his followers, like Robert Roberts, as like being a regular guy. Roberts was convinced, despite the evidence that he said he was really plain and ordinary, he was convinced that he was someone special to adore and admire and respect, but it was someone who was also worthy of sacrificing anything to appease. And this was definitely a huge red flag that in the 1800s, their dynamic looks an awful lot like a cult leader and a loyal follower. This is kind of a letdown for someone who was raised on the standard lines of Christadelphians. Like, we only believe our Bibles. We don't have a leader. We're not a cult. Like, okay. If you're not a cult, tell me what his exhortation was about. Like, what Bible verses did he quote? Like, come on, Robert Roberts. Shouldn't the intellectual content of the exhortation be more engrossing than the enunciation and the inflection and the style that mesmerized Roberts? Like, you were just watching him and like crying like a Swiftie at a concert. So Roberts was losing it because he was so thrilled to finally see like his hero in person. And on the other side of things, John Thomas was finally able to meet the young protege who had been writing to him in America. And Roberts was making a name for himself. Besides carrying the burden of all the work that brothers were expected to do, which basically meant just giving exhortations constantly, he also had recently written and published lectures that were marketed to the general public. Collier wrote that, quote, "It is evident that Dr. Thomas in America found early opportunity to examine the lectures and formed the opinion that the young author was the right man to follow up his work and to start a magazine in England. The Civil War was broken out in the States, the Herald had necessarily been suspended, and the doctor was ready to pay a visit to Great Britain. He came in 1862, unquote. Now that Thomas had finally arrived in England and was staying with the Roberts, he was finally able to confirm his suspicions about the suitability of Roberts to be molded into an instrument for his movement. And now he could begin shaping Roberts to be his successor. And I think he used manipulation. During his stay, Collier tells us that, quote, Dr. Thomas, sometime during his visit, put forward two practical suggestions which had a great influence on later events. He remarked that he thought Birmingham was the best center for work in England, and he suggested that his young host was the right man to start a magazine, unquote. And Collier adds on that, quote, the idea was taken up by some on the spot, unquote. Within 2 years, Roberts had relocated to Birmingham, as suggested by Dr. Thomas. And no, Dr. Thomas didn't tell him he had to. Dr. Thomas told him to jump, and Roberts basically said, how high? What's more surprising is that Roberts was looking for work, and he thought to himself, if God provides a job in Birmingham, that's my message, that I should go to Birmingham. So, like, you would assume Robert Roberts got a job in Birmingham and he moved, right? No, wrong. Okay, it is wild. He got 4 job offers in different places. None of them around Birmingham. None of them in Birmingham. So if he was looking for a sign, the sign was, don't do it. However, he didn't care. He declined all 4 job offers and just moved to Birmingham with no income and no job. I mean, he had a wife and kids. So why did he move to Birmingham with no job? Because John Thomas thought it was a good idea. He ignored the signs. He ignored them. And did John Thomas provide any funding for this move when he was poor and jobless? No. John Thomas didn't have anything at stake here. It was Robert Roberts who was giving up his family's income, who was leaving the stability of his job, leaving his ecclesia, who was screaming at him like vampire zombies, and who was risking, his life to please this guy in America. And what's interesting is this happens a lot in cults, by the way. Like right now on Netflix, you can watch the Twin Flames documentary. And towards the end, it talks about them building like their own little commune kind of thing. And they're basically trying to relocate their members there. And I mean, there's also like Jonestown where they made like their own little town and stories like that. So I see this as kind of a red flag where he's like, oh, like, I'm going to tell you where to live. He's met this person one time in his life, maybe twice. He did 2 visits. I feel like this is pretty clear that John Thomas is exerting a lot more influence on Robert Roberts than is normal. I would not, just give up my job and move away to a place where I have no job, no financial support, no family, no nothing, because some guy I met once was like, hey, like, I think you should go work for me there, but like, I'm not going to pay you. You should just do unpaid work for me there. No, that's not normal. Sorry. So here's a red flag for anyone who's looking for it. What's worse is that Roberts almost moved twice. So earlier in his life, Roberts took a job that required a lot of travel, and this is with those phrenologists that I mentioned earlier. And Collier explains why this was appealing to Roberts since they, quote, came from New York and intended to return thither when the English tour was over. There seemed an excellent prospect of going with them, and Dr. Thomas was living in New York, unquote. And you're welcome for hearing me say thither. Ugh. But yeah, Dr. Thomas was living in New York, and Robert Roberts seriously was taking this job to work with these phrenologists to have the chance to move to New York to be near the doctor. He had never even met the man at that point and was taking jobs trying to find a way to make it feasible to move to New York just to be near him, to be near this man he'd never met. And it's once again sort of sad for Robert Roberts. Collier records that when Roberts arrived in Birmingham, quote, the brethren in Birmingham had a tea meeting to welcome the new arrivals. And when the collection was taken, Robert Roberts put his last coin in the bag, unquote. Like, Roberts really put his comfort, his finances, and the well-being of his family second to the desires of John Thomas. He was shaping his life to John Thomas's desires, not what was best for him or his family. And Roberts did eventually begin to work on the other suggestion from John Thomas for him to become a writer and editor of a magazine dedicated to John Thomas's teachings. The magazine was originally entitled The Ambassador of the Coming Age, which was generally just referred to as The Ambassador. Once John Thomas, finally got around to naming his followers, the magazine followed suit and changed its name to the present name by which it is known today, the Christadelphian. This happened when John Thomas visited Roberts, according to Collier. He writes that, quote, if he were starting a magazine in England, he would call it the Christadelphian, and he gave weight reasons for this choice. He did not present the idea as advice, but he was clearly pleased when the next year the Ambassador changed its name to the Christadelphian, unquote. Once again, Robert Roberts immediately leapt to do anything John Thomas talked about, regardless of how direct or indirectly he was asked to do so. I am sure that John Thomas made that comment knowing that Robert Roberts would immediately try to figure out how to make it happen. He wanted to make John Thomas happy, so he didn't even have to ask him to do it. He just knew he would. One other thing I want to mention here is this is where Robert Roberts gets his own nickname. So Dr. Thomas was eventually simply called the Doctor. Once Roberts began editing the magazine for Thomas, he became the editor. So you'll start to see that later on in all of his biographies and so on. So John Thomas was thrilled with this change. Before the Civil War shut down the production of his magazine, he had been putting a lot of time and money into this magazine, and sometimes other people's money, because he kind of stole a printing press since he took it when he moved, and the people who bought it were really pissed about that. But anyways, now Thomas didn't have to deal with all the hard work of putting together a magazine. Instead, he could just write anything he wanted and just send it to Roberts, who would put it in the magazine and distribute it. Retirement was finally on the horizon for Thomas, now that Roberts was eager and happy to be doing this work for him for free. Unfortunately, that was hard to sustain for free, so a cryptic deal was struck. John Thomas came back for his second visit to Europe, and this time Collier writes that, quote, Dr. Thomas paid another visit to England, and among the arrangements he made was a settlement of the editorial position. By some means a living was provided, obviating the necessity for the struggle in the commercial world, which is a whole-time occupation for most men, and often imposes a severe strain on unpaid teachers, even without an editorial or publishing responsibilities, unquote. So every reference to this is super secretive. So I honestly don't know if anyone alive knows the specifics of this deal. It's possible there's something in the archive at the Christadelphian magazine, but I don't have access to that, so I haven't been able to find out the details. But something seems to have happened where Dr. Thomas suddenly had a lot of cash, that he could give to pay him to do this. Wonder where that came from. So, honestly, it sounds like he just handed over a wad of cash. Maybe they split the profits or something. It's very vague about the details about how this arrangement worked. It was also a scandal, and there were comments from other Christadelphians that Roberts should basically work a job to support himself just like they do. And Roberts recorded in his autobiography that one reader told him that, quote, "You act like a madman. Your tendencies are in the worst direction. What new folly is this that you aspire to live off preaching and printing your peculiar ideas? By the first love you had for the truth and the virgin hatred we had for all hirelings, cease to ape the clergy. Work fairly and honestly for your bread, and give the truth for nothing. How can you denounce those you seek to imitate?" Unquote. So it sounds like the subscribers were probably now funding the magazine where they're paying for it instead of getting it for free, or that their donations to Thomas had been redirected to paying a salary or something. Roberts and Collier both refused to elaborate on it and be transparent, which, great, not concerning at all to see that finances aren't transparent. Not a problem at all, right? So I just don't have the evidence to provide any specifics here, but that was the situation. So regardless, through whatever mysterious means, John Thomas sets Roberts up so that Roberts no longer has to work a regular job while managing the magazine on the side. Instead, Roberts can now devote all of his time to working on his magazine for John Thomas as a paid employee for John Thomas. Honestly, it was a win-win because Roberts had no other ambitions or desires than to be a good Christadelphian and to be in the kingdom of God and to make John Thomas happy. Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas needed someone to take on preaching his religion and do the hard work for him as he planned his retirement. However, the other followers of John Thomas weren't just furious that Roberts was now receiving a wage for his work on the magazine. They were also mad about the hierarchy among the men in the group, almost like women in Christadelphia are treated today. Roberts' writings would make up the bulk of the magazine, and anything that John Thomas wrote would also be included in the magazine. And this preferential treatment was noticed and criticized harshly. They said it was censorship and favoritism, basically. Unfortunately for Roberts, these claims were true. As we've already seen, Roberts was devoted to Thomas, and the whole point of the magazine was to publish what Thomas wanted published. Despite Roberts being the editor, he was voluntarily under control of Thomas. It was his reverence and obedience to Thomas that made him the perfect pick for this editor position. Thomas could trust that Roberts would never publish anything negative about him or allow anyone to change his doctrine or prevent Dr. Thomas from publishing his writings. Collier recorded that even after Thomas's death in 1871, quote, "In the year 1875, he, Roberts, reaffirmed his determination to give Dr. Thomas the first place. He was resolved to maintain this feature of his policy to the end, but he had no idea how long delayed the end would be," unquote. Surprise, Jesus never came back. So Roberts was stuck publishing this magazine until he died. And they've still been publishing it and go through editor after editor. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a delay. Yeah, they should probably call customer support about that delivery of Jesus Christ. But it's interesting here that Roberts still revered Thomas so much that he would republish material over and over again rather than publish other living Christadelphian writers, and they weren't happy about that. Collier wrote that, quote, "Some recorders were sure that the diffuse items of intelligence they had sent were of more general interest than all of the details the editor included in his diary about personal discomforts, his family, lost luggage, and so forth. No doubt readers of the present day would still be more irritated if anyone now living produced such a diary," unquote. Yeah, that's a valid argument. Apparently his justification for just publishing his diary entries instead of, actual researched information and articles related to the Bible was that, quote, "It is a daily record of events with a running commentary from the point of view of one who was in the world but not of it," unquote. Sure, whatever you say. But it is recorded that at one point they didn't have enough copy for the next issue, so Robert sent over 7 pages about his travel. 7 pages! Like, maybe if you had published other writers, you'd be getting more submissions. But I would think they'd stop writing, sending submissions when you keep ignoring them because you keep publishing about, losing your luggage and sightseeing on your travels. So, redirecting back to John Thomas again. Robert's brother-in-law, William Norrie, wrote that, quote, he no doubt exercised a strict enough supervision over the generality of his correspondence. But there was one of them whom he appeared to be exempt from all supervision. This was Dr. Thomas, whose communications published in the Ambassador sometimes contained slanderous statements respecting certain of the brethren. These slanders were freely admitted into the magazine, and spoken of approvingly by its editor. Dr. Thomas was a man who had suffered much himself from the misrepresentation and falsehood of his opponents, and it might have been expected that he, of all men, would have been careful to observe what had been well called the golden rule in dealing with what he regarded as erring brethren. Instead of that, he at times indulged in the peculiar style of superlative personal abuse, in which he was a past master, and R. Roberts, instead of exercising the strictest editorial supervision and deleting the offensive passages, welcomed them gladly and gave them ready circulation in his periodical. In view of this partiality for the scurrilities of Dr. Thomas, it seems quite ludicrous to read the following self-satisfied declaration by the editor. Our rule is to exclude everything from the pages of the Ambassador at all tending to personalities, believing it to be a healthier policy to bestow exclusive attention upon its cosmopolitan relations, which will wear out all the petty heats and jealousies of a passing generation. A healthier policy? Truly, Robert. Then why did you not carry it out yourself, and insist that Dr. Thomas should also conform to it? Unquote. Yeah, this was his brother-in-law laying into Robert Roberts, just pointing out the double standard. Like, you are saying that we should treat others as we want to be treated, and then you have John Thomas just bullying people, and you're responsible for publishing it. Like, this is completely fair. John Thomas was mean. He was brutal in his writings, and that made Roberts complicit when he refused to edit John Thomas's submissions for the magazine. It was a clear double standard. It was favoritism. And Roberts was John Thomas's protector. He took all this criticism from the other followers and Dr. Thomas because he was devoted to him. And I do find one quote that is probably not a favorite of modern Christadelphians, but it could partially explain Robert Roberts' reverence for Dr. Thomas. While the doctored modern Christadelphians claim to deny Thomas being a prophet, okay, Dr. Thomas did dance around to claim that he was like an instrument of God and sharing God's message. Roberts recorded an excerpt of a speech Dr. Thomas gave to his early followers in England in his autobiography. Roberts records the doctor as saying, quote, "So you see," said the doctor, "when the divine inventor and the proprietor of the apocalypse requires its exposition, he has the means at hand. The heaven-sent document is his. He sent it for a purpose," unquote. Oh, like you think that the document was the Bible? No. Good guess. It was not. If you look at it in the context of his autobiography, this is a reference to Dr. Thomas talking about his books, Eureka, and all of his exposition of Revelation and the prophecy of the apocalypse. Dr. Thomas was explaining how God was providing followers to pay for its publication. I guess God wasn't done writing the Bible after all, because he was just waiting for John Thomas to come along, and John Thomas was going to explain it to everybody for him. He was, the instrument God was choosing. It's Dr. Thomas's name on the book, and the fact that he's the author of this book is literally chiseled on his gravestone. This is of human origin, but here he is saying that this book is, quote, heaven sent, unquote. The claim that his book belongs to the divine inventor seems to imply a close association with God, and that he is then presumably a direct instrument of God. Is that not a synonym for prophet? So, no wonder he was using that to market his book and continue to tell gullible followers like Robert Roberts what to do. It's clear that Roberts bought into this messaging that John Thomas, was close to God and doing God's work and providing this book that God wanted them to read, since he thought this claim was significant enough that he recorded it in his autobiography about his life. There was also an incident in which Roberts kind of felt like John Thomas was similar to Jesus. Apparently Roberts found out that John Thomas was coming to England, but John Thomas was like really coy about it and like refused to tell him when he was coming. Maybe it was just a power move, like I don't know. So Collier records that, quote, he gave no hint as to the probable time of his arrival in Birmingham. When Robert Roberts ascertained from the steamship company that Dr. Thomas and his daughter had arrived in Liverpool and had gone ashore, he met every train in Liverpool for 2 days, unquote. And that, quote, they saw the suggestion of an allegory in the experience, the keen desire, the tense expectancy, the long period of waiting, and then the sudden arrival in an hour as they thought not, unquote. And I'll admit he didn't specifically call him Jesus, but it's interesting that in his mind, he was waiting for the doctor the way he said he was waiting for Jesus. Like, I don't think that mindset was indicative of a healthy relationship to be waiting more eagerly for the doctor than for Jesus. He wasted 2 days at the train station waiting for someone who went out of his way to not tell him when he was coming. And maybe there's a lesson there for people waiting for Jesus. However, Collier writes that, quote, Dr. Thomas stayed in Birmingham for about 4 weeks. It was probably the happiest month his host ever enjoyed. Robert Roberts never wavered in his deep appreciation of the man from whom he had learned. To him, Dr. Thomas was the best, the most Christ-like, and the most spiritually minded of all the men he had ever known, unquote. And that, quote, in private life, he reminded us of Christ by a gravity of deportment that was mixed with urbanity, and a dignity that was sustained by unfeigned humility, a quiet penetrating depth of intelligence, weakened by the least approach of frivolity, a cordial interest that was free and natural in all things connected to the truth, unquote. Okay. And again, the doctor never claimed to be Jesus Christ, but his followers saw him as this powerful religious figure who was knowledgeable, admirable, and closely associated with Christ. They felt like they were with Jesus when they were with him. He was supposedly so Christ-like, which also I find pretty hard to believe if you read about him from his contemporaries who would vigorously disagree with this whole thing. Unfortunately, Robert's infatuation and almost worship of Dr. Thomas actually cost him some of his friends and family. Roberts wrote in his autobiography about his relationship suffering due to his loyalty to John Thomas and this rigid way of thinking about religion. He wrote that, quote, if the charm was broken by and by, it was because the truth stood in a different position among my new friends from what I had assumed. Dr. Thomas was not esteemed as I esteemed him. His works were not appreciated as I suppose they necessarily must be by everyone, understanding the truth. And the Bible and the truth had not that earnest place which seemed to me essential in a company professing subjection to us apostolic principles, unquote. Roberts could not tolerate two things: people who believed differently in the Bible than Dr. Thomas, and anyone who did not love the doctor and feel the same devotion that he felt. It wasn't enough to believe the teachings. He was talking about people who, he says, understood the truth. But every one of these people must admire, respect, and adore Dr. Thomas to the same degree that Roberts did. That was the only way to be accepted by Robert Roberts. So whenever conflict arose where Robert Roberts would have to side with the doctor or someone else, he always chose to align himself with Dr. Thomas. And at one time, a rift developed between Roberts and the members of an ecclesia in Edinburgh. This ecclesia was significant as his wife, Jane, her family were members there, and they had obviously close ties with them. But despite the familial ties, Roberts wrote that, quote, the chief disintegrator lay in the animus shown towards Dr. Thomas, who I venerated with an ardor that time has not diminished. And next, in the little interest taken in the truth, which he had been instrumental in recovering from sectarian darkness, and which formed the ground and the sole ground of my enthusiastic attachment, and next in the various oppositions to both points of truth advocated by him, and to a hearty policy in such part of the truth as they admitted, unquote. Robert's first point of contention with the ecclesial members was that they really didn't revere John Thomas the way he did. The second problem was that they didn't agree with everything the doctor believed. Like, this independent thinking, this lack of loyalty to the doctor was unforgivable for Roberts. This became one of the earliest known splits among ecclesias, because these believers in Edinburgh broke away from Dr. Thomas and Robert's family chose their leader over their family. By this point, I hope that you can start to see the signs that Robert Roberts' devotion to Dr. John Thomas and his religion was a bit stronger than would be considered healthy, normal behavior. However, I have a few more points to share. I found 3 things that I think are insane and shocking for anyone who doesn't know them, and are perfectly able to illustrate how obsessed Robert Roberts was with John Thomas. All right, are you ready? You ready for the first one? The first example are the names that Robert and Jane chose for their children. Any guesses for their son's name? Any guesses? Guess what it is? John Thomas. They named their son John Thomas. Ugh. Okay, and let's just pretend Roberts and Jane Roberts, they admired Dr. Thomas, but those are common names. John Thomas. All right, he's not the only one that ever existed. You Google it, there's other John Thomases still. Maybe it's a one-off thing. But wait, let's look at his daughter's name. What's his daughter's name? Eleanor Roberts. Why Eleanor? Do you remember the name of John Thomas's wife? Miss Eleanor Hunt, that I told you about in that episode? Yeah, Eleanor Hunt Thomas. Now we've got Eleanor Roberts. Well, it's a little weird to name your children after a married couple who, runs your religion and that you devote all your time and money to and cut your family off for. Oh, but that's not all. Nope. I've got one more. John Thomas had a daughter, and he named her a name that I have literally never heard anywhere in the world except as the name of his daughter. I don't know anyone else who has this name. If they do, say hi, because I've never met anyone else with this name. It is the Greek word for pious or religious. And I don't even 100% know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, so if I'm wrong, sorry. Eusebia. And so guess what beautiful common English name to go with little John Thomas, to go with little Eleanor Roberts? Miss Eusebia Roberts. Like, are you kidding me? You literally named your children after every single member of his family, his daughter, his wife. Like, unfortunately, they ran out of names because John and Ellen only had one kid. Like, and as a side note, this is the earliest instant I could find of another common occurrence in the Christadelphian community. Naming a child after a random Hebrew or Greek word. I remember the first time I heard a young couple talk about this, and they shared at like a youth weekend how their child was named after a word from the Bible. And I mean, as a kid, I was caught somewhere between impressed and horrified. Like, this was a status symbol among Christadelphians to show off how dedicated you were to the Lord, to name your child like this biblical name. But like, realistically, that kid is just going to be bullied relentlessly and no one's going to know their name. It's not going to be on any like keychains at the boardwalk. Like, you feel kind of bad too. And one of my siblings, who is a Christadelphian, has done this and just gives their children Bible names, but like random Hebrew words. And it almost feels like cultural appropriation because like, we are not Jewish. We're not from Israel. Like, we're not Israeli. Like, we have no ancestry there. But it's just this Christadelphian tradition again. And the practice seems to have actually started with Dr. John Thomas. So now Robert Roberts named 3 of his children after the 3 members of the Thomas family. Totally normal behavior. And what's weird is that he actually didn't mention this in his biography, which feels like a striking omission. Like, he is proud of his obsession with the doctor. He has not hidden it anywhere in his biography. Like, oh, like, let me tone this down a notch. But no, that's very much the opposite. But it's weird because in his autobiography, Roberts mentions the birth of his son, Edward Augustus, who he says they had considered naming John Thomas at the time, but decided against. Apparently, John Thomas was being a real prick to Robert Roberts at the time. So he was like, if you don't stop being mean to me, I won't name my kid after you, basically. And you would think that would be a wake-up call to Robert Roberts to, like, have a thought about that, but it wasn't. It just, did not happen. And it was right around the time that they broke off ties with his wife Jane's family. Roberts wrote that they lost their daughter Lydia Jane, and then they almost lost their son Edwards. Roberts writes in his autobiography that, quote, "This child would have been called John Thomas if clouds, soon dispelled, had not arisen. In the temporary estrangement, we went afield and selected a name, in which, however, there is nothing divine. The bearer of the name grew up safely to manhood and is now in the metropolis following the profession of his intended namesake," unquote. So Edward, his son, who, yes, did survive this incident, was supposed to be named John Thomas, and he literally became a doctor. He literally would have been Dr. John Thomas. Number 2, Roberts was going to make him a new Dr. John Thomas. But like Roberts, but also John Thomas. But the doctors had been so much of an asshole and just giving them the cold shoulder and pressuring them to cut ties with their family, which they did. But he lost that opportunity, and I don't even know what to do with this. This feels insane to me. Okay. And Roberts also writes, in his book, he writes that he named a daughter after his wife, Jane. Very sweet. Okay, loves his wife. Great. But weirdly, he never mentions the naming of these other 3, John Thomas, Eleanor, and Eusebia. And I'm just going to be bold and say, like, maybe that's not normal to name your kids after the family members of your religious leader. Like, maybe he knew that. I don't think it was healthy. And the fact that it happened indicates that there is more than a healthy level of admiration there. I will also add that many of his children actually, pretty sadly, died young, including the one who I assume was his favorite, John Thomas. And this is recorded in his biography by Collier, and it actually happened the same year as the first Christadelphian fraternal gathering, shortly after the death of the original old man, John Thomas. Collier records, quote, "Near the end of the year, death visited the home again, and 2 children were taken in 1 month. John Thomas, a little 4-year-old, who had been named after the doctor, had endeared himself to many. He was intelligent and tractable, with a childish readiness to follow his father's line of thought, always most engaging to a parent, even though it is obvious that the child's ideas are only an uncritical reflection of parental teaching. If Robert Roberts came in from work tired and harassed, and sitting down rather wearily said, 'How I wish,' the little boy would finish his sentence for him, 'that Christ would come.' He knew that this was the only constant and all-pervading wish of his father's heart. Death took the child, and within a few days, a little daughter, 2 years old, succumbed to the same disease," unquote. In a sexist twist, it turned out that little unnamed daughter was the child named for the wife of the Christadelphians' founder, who also had no real acknowledgement of her existence. Eleanor, remember her? And I was able to find the Roberts family tree on Ancestry.com, and it shows Eleanor T. Roberts. So I assume that was also Eleanor Thomas Roberts. But she only lived from 1871 to 1872. John Thomas Roberts lived from 1868 to 1872. So they did die of the same year and apparently the same month of the same disease, which was not specified that I saw. So of his children named for the Thomas family, only Eusebia Roberts survived to adulthood, and she lived from 1867 to 1951. It's actually pretty wild that death struck so significantly in John Thomas's and Robert Roberts' family tree. John Thomas had only one daughter, and she married, but her husband died before they had any children, and she never remarried or had children. So that was the end of the Thomas family tree. Meanwhile, Robert Roberts attempted to carry on John Thomas's name and his children, skipping his first chance, and then doing it with the second son, naming him John Thomas, but then that one died. And if you read enough Christadelphian works, you'll see how shocked some Christadelphians were that prosperity gospel belief didn't apply to these figures. Because, I mean, if God is using John Thomas as this instrument for his work, why did he kill this little innocent 4-year-old boy that was named after him? Like, that seems like a really cruel twist, to have the one who was supposed to be named after John Thomas grow up to be a doctor, while the one that people thought would carry on the name of God's chosen vessel dies. Like, that's just wild that you have Dr. Edward and then you have dead John Thomas Jr. Interesting. It seems like God kind of went out of his way to be like, please don't. One of the executors of John Thomas's will was a guy named Brother Bosher, and he believed in the prosperity gospel. He wrote in the Christadelphian magazine in the November 1869 edition that, quote, "We are delighted with the hope of having him," this is referring to John Thomas, "with us on the side of the Atlantic during the rest of his days. It really seems as if God were about to give him an installment of his reward before the final reward comes, by letting him see the fruit of his long labors and sacrifice in the cause of truth, and that the land of his nativity is to yield the largest amount of fruit." The only problem with this is that John Thomas died right before moving to his retirement home in England. So that didn't happen. Sorry, Brother Bosher. Prosperity gospel, not true. That was all the first point. Let's get into the second insane thing Robert Roberts did that shows his devotion to John Thomas. Okay. So I just mentioned Brother Bosher, and he's relevant to this next part because he's the other executor of John Thomas's will besides Robert Roberts. The family for John Thomas was all women, so obviously they can't do it because of the patriarchy. So these two guys from England hop on a ship and travel to America to handle the funeral arrangements with John Thomas's family, go through his papers, all that stuff. So the day of John Thomas's funeral comes around. Let's set the scene. April 30th, 1871, in Greenwood Cemetery, New York, New York. Going back to the time, April 30th, I should point out that the doctor died on March 5th. So it was almost 2 months before they laid his body to rest officially. But luckily for Robert Roberts, he was able to see him one last time, twice more specifically, because he viewed Thomas's body in the temporary crypt that it had been stored in, and he described it this way, quote, "7 weeks in death had sadly marred the noble contour of his countenance. The eyes were sunken and scarcely like eyes, nose swollen, flesh ghastly in color, mouth slightly open, head resting on the crown, elevating the chin and beard. The beard was the only remaining feature of beauty. It was pure white and full and well ordered. I had had a difficulty heretofore in realizing his death, and now all illusion was dispelled. The terrible reality of the fact was forced home. I touched the cold, lifeless hand in the coffin. I handled his beard, and passed my hand once more over the noble arch of his upper brain, which had evolved so much for our profit during life." Unquote. I mean, why is he fondling his beard on his corpse? Ugh. All right. Let me read you a direct quote from the Christadelphian magazine. It reads, quote, "A wish had been expressed that a portion of the doctor's beautiful beard might be rescued from the worms as a memento of affection. Accordingly, the upper portion of the lid being once more removed, the editor, with a pair of scissors with which he had provided himself, rapidly performed the necessary operation, removing the principal portion of the beard and wrapping it in a piece of paper. The aspect of the dead was less pleasing to contemplate in the full blaze of the morning sun than it was seen in the vault by the light of a lamp. The hideousness of rapidly progressing decomposition was more apparent. The triumph of corruption over a noble nature was more striking. The reality of death was more painfully evident." Unquote. Oh, that is disgusting. So, yeah, Robert Roberts got a full look at John Thomas's rotting body almost 2 months after he died, and it was rancid. And I mean, at least he didn't take the whole body and sell it, right? Like, that would have been a full circle moment. And if you're confused about why I say that, go listen to the true crime episode for some context on body snatching and grave robbing. And there's still more to unpack here. I mean, clearly he had planned to get that beard. Like, he brought scissors. You think he just had scissors in his pocket? Like, no, he would have like a notebook. He was an editor. He was not having scissors. He was ready. He had already fondled that beard. He was not letting it go a second time. He knew he only had one chance left. But like, why did he want the beard anyways? Like, I feel like I would want like a really nice photo, not like someone's hair. Also, did he share it with John Thomas's wife, Ellen? Like, did Ellen want the hair? Was she horrified to see like her husband's buddy from England interrupt the funeral to cut off his beard? Like, what was her reaction to this? Like, if I was that wife, I would probably be furious. I'd be like, no, like, your friend can't steal your beard. No. And I feel like this is the sort of thing that makes people speculate that they were lovers. Because, like, he writes here, he wanted it as a memento of affection. That's some pretty serious affection. And he also lived his entire life doing what John Thomas wanted. And he believed what he was told to believe. He moved where he was told to move. He worked a job he was told to work. He named his kids after John Thomas. He housed John Thomas during his visits. He sent money to John Thomas. He could waste days waiting for him at the train station. This was an unhealthy obsession with this man. So, I mean, it kind of just fits in with this bigger picture. My last thought, because again, so many thoughts about this. Where is the beard? Who has it? I need to know. Like, I have theories. I have all kinds of theories, like, the string everywhere. So I have a theory. Did it get passed down to his daughters who remain Christadelphians? They moved to Australia. Is it in one of his great grandchildren's like attics in Australia? But also the risk of that. Did someone go, ooh, gross old man here from the 1800s and throw it away? Or did it stay in Birmingham and is it hidden in the archives of the Christadelphian magazine? Or do you think he carried it with him and was buried with it? Do you think he took it to his grave? Because he wasn't going to take his hands off it. He probably died with this thing like in a locket in his hand. So if you have any information on the whereabouts of this 1871 clump of pure white John Thomas beard, I want to know. I have not been able to find any information on the whereabouts of this beard. I am honest when I'm saying I want to know what happened to it. I emailed the Christadelphian magazine and asked them what happened to the beard. And they're like, oh, that was a myth. No, maybe they're hiding it. Christadelphian magazine was like, oh, this is a myth. You published it. That quote I just read was from the Christadelphian magazine. This was your publication. How can you claim that what you wrote and published is a rumor? What happened to it? Are you hiding the beard? Where's that disgusting clump of beard hair? I want to know. Is it like on the wall? It's probably like framed in there. I don't know. There's so much going on in that quote. It is revolting, and I can't stop thinking about it. And now you have to know too. You are also burdened with this knowledge of wondering, where did the beard hair go? Why was he fondling it in this crypt? Everything is so weird. And now you always think about that when you think about Robert Roberts and John Thomas. Tell me you won't remember that. Of all these things I've told you in the podcast, I've read you quotes and told you stories. You're not going to think about the police moms. You're going to think about that beard hair, and you're going to wonder at night, where's the beard hair? All right. We still have one more. What's the third insane thing I learned about Robert Roberts? And that shows his insane relationship with John Thomas. Okay. So Robert Roberts continued to travel and preach just like John Thomas. Towards the end of his life, he traveled from his home in Australia, which he had essentially retired to after leaving Birmingham, England, and he traveled to California in the United States. World travelers, these Christadelphians, let me tell you. Despite his avid shoe shining and walking regimen for exercise, he was sadly found dead and alone in his hotel room after taking a cold shower, which was suspected of being too much for his body to handle. When the brothers began handling arrangements for his body, someone reached out to the Thomas family and was just like, hey, can he get buried with Dr. Thomas? And they approved it. Robert Roberts is now buried in New York, New York. And like that plot was only made for like 3 graves. So Robert Roberts is buried in a country he never lived in. He is buried across the world from his wife Jane and his children. He wasn't even buried in the place that he died in California. No, they shipped his body across the entire country to New York. He is buried in a place with absolutely no meaning to him, other than that the guy he spent his entire life dedicated to and basically worshiping was buried there. I mean, he spent his life at Dr. Thomas's beck and call, and now his body resides forever next to him. They are not family. They had no relation, but they're buried together, and their relationship was so close that people thought that this is what Robert Roberts would have wanted. Not to be with his wife, but to be with his leader. And I couldn't believe it. I've never heard of someone being buried next to like their pastor or like their reverend in like a family plot, but that's figurative of his entire life, isn't it? He spent his entire life in the shadow of Dr. Thomas, always ready and waiting to be told what to do and where to go and what to say. And I mean, I feel like maybe they thought they would be together, like if they got resurrected and be like, hey, high five, we did it. But like, obviously, like we've seen plenty of generations of Christophians pass away, so no rush. What's actually really terrible, like just genuinely terrible, is that some people have blamed his son Edward for like stressing his dad out because apparently Roberts had only recently found out his son and his son's family were no longer Christadelphians and, you know, not really having great social and emotional skills. People say that he just couldn't handle it and maybe like the stress of his son not being a Christadelphian killed him. I think that that opinion is so cruel to his son, who is literally an adult just living his life. And it's so manipulative to be like, well, you shouldn't have left because now you killed your father. Like, no, this was an older man who chose to travel alone at that age, was choosing to take cold showers, choosing to eat whatever he was eating, you know, sleep however he's sleeping, like not probably taking the best care of himself. You know, yeah, he shined a lot of shoes, but I don't think it was working based on what we've read. And if he hadn't found a way to cope with stress at his age, like that's on him. It's not everybody else's job to make you happy. That's just about you trying to control everyone. Like, good on his son for getting out and taking back control of his life because that dynamic is toxic. And I think that's why there's so many ex-Christadelphians dealing with the consequences of being raised a people pleaser, because that's really what it is. Like, they were literally told, you have to do this to make me happy. Your opinion doesn't matter. These people then grow up struggling to know who they are, struggling to make decisions for themselves, and struggling to even know who they are because it wasn't allowed or encouraged. And look at the kind of behavior they get when they do stick up for themselves and do make a decision for themselves. And again, as adults, as informed adults, making a decision with their eyes open, like for themselves, just terrible. So, throughout this episode, I have shown you how Robert Roberts got sucked into John Thomas's orbit and continued to give more and more of himself to the Christadelphian cause. But before we wrap up this episode, I promise it's coming, I also want to share some less known information about their differences. I actually find this pretty sad, because I think if Robert Roberts had access to all of the knowledge that we have now, he might have been able to leave the group and actually live his life. The first example was actually their opinion on the Civil War. Dr. John Thomas supported the Confederacy. If you didn't already know, you're going to know about it in another episode. Roberts wrote in his autobiography of Thomas that, quote, his sympathies were with the South on several grounds. His friends were mainly in the South and comprised several planters who, though owning slaves, were men of an open, generous hand, under whom the colored people were better provided for than in a state of freedom. Then he had an idea that the institution was not of unscriptural character contended for by the extreme abolitionists, but conformable in some respects to the state of society existing in the days of Abraham and 1,500 years later in the days of Paul. Finally, he had a partiality for the state of society existing in the South, which he considered more refined than the North, owing to the considerable presence of an English aristocratic element derived from the early settlers, unquote. So John Thomas liked feeling wealthy and privileged in Southern society. He was a friend to slave owners and felt that owning slaves was actually scriptural, so it was okay with it. And despite, kidnapping, rape, lack of civil rights, abuse, murders, lynching, torture, breaking up families, etc., 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 yeah, that's all right. Yeah, that's fine. God's cool with that. On the other hand, Roberts wrote that, quote, we differed from the doctor somewhat in these views, but our agreement on scriptural things was so fervent that our divergencies on American politics made no sensible ripple. He earnestly hoped the South would roll back the Northern invasion, while our wishes were for Northern success. But we all felt it a matter of indifference by the side of Israel's hope. Let Christ come and take the government, and all would be well in all questions. Therefore we could leave personal views on an ephemeral question in abeyance." Unquote. Sure sounds like you care about it, but are just in denial. But it's not surprising since this is the classic Christophian stance on politics. Like, they have opinions on it, but they'll pretend they don't, and they'll also refuse to take any tangible action. But, like, isn't it also just odd? Like, you're both reading the same Bible. Shouldn't you have the same views on it? It seems to me like Robert Roberts had empathy, and even having not seen the condition of slaves in the South, because he really didn't go to the United States really until John Thomas died. But of course, Robert Roberts refused to break away from John Thomas over these differences. He wrote that, quote, "My own natural bias in favor of human freedom thus strengthened, and the strong pro-Northern paper politics of the Huddersfield Examiner with which I was connected made me feel I had something to regret in the doctor's Confederate sympathies. If the truth had not been as mutually powerful as it was, the difference would have cooled off our sympathies. As it was, it made absolutely no difference," unquote. If he was allowed to have his own opinions, and yeah, I'm going to say allowed, because his cognitive dissonance basically made it so there was no option, Robert Roberts would have chosen not to associate with John Thomas over this. He saw the difference in morals and values that is, again, a conversation that is still happening to this day over, people talking about human rights, human freedom, and whether or not people can have that as being a dividing line, and whether they can associate with someone. Robert Roberts felt that. He said, he had a bias in favor of human freedom. He was pro-North. But then he goes back to, well, we're all brothers in Christ. So he chose John Thomas over his own moral compass. And I have one more example. This is my favorite. This one I'll probably post on the social media so more people see it because I love this one. So Robert Roberts wrote about some drama that happened while John Thomas was visiting Europe on one of his 2 tours in his autobiography. Roberts wrote that, quote, "During his tour, his mind was poisoned against me by envious seniors, who were more alive to their personal consequence than to the great and glorious work of which the doctor was a humble instrument, and which I was striving with all my might to abet. I saw and felt the change when he returned from his journey, but I knew it would only be temporary when the doctor came to know the men he was dealing with. It turned out as anticipated, but it took time, and meanwhile his manifestly unfriendly bias was a trial to me, quite a bitter one for a time. Had I not been a daily reader and a fervent lover of the oracles of God for myself, I should have turned away in disgust. As it was, it made me turn round, as it were, and look at the Bible again and see if Dr. Thomas was really right. There was only one answer, and therefore I swallowed my bitters and made up my mind to wait." Unquote. That one gets me. Robert Roberts knew he was being treated poorly, knew it was wrong, did not want to tolerate it, wanted to do something. And I imagine this was really hard for him to live with, because throughout his life, he was willing to ignore all of John Thomas's flaws. He was willing to defend him. He was willing to look up to him, admire him, praise him. Like, just imagine Taylor Swift did this to a Swiftie and just, like, laid into them until they cried. Like, that's what I'm picturing. Just, like, this person who just adored them, just feeling this shame and sadness and honestly, like, a broken heart, because they had truly felt like love and adoration for this, like, celebrity in their life. This is the only time that I found that Roberts wrote about this internal pushing back and considering if he was on the right path. This was so significant to him, how he was being treated by John Thomas, that he finally went back to the Bible with the intention of trying to find a way to prove John Thomas wrong. If John Thomas was wrong, then there would no need to, like, wait and tolerate this bad behavior and, like, suck up to get back into his good graces after the smear campaign against him by other Christadelphians. Robert Roberts was so close, like, so close to leaving, but he had already been indoctrinated for decades at this point. Like, it would be hard for anyone to try to change how they interpret something at that point. Like, honestly, anything, any religion. You try after like 3 decades to be like, okay, read this as if it's for the first time. That would be hard after so much conditioning and indoctrination. And that's why, like, I feel like if he genuinely wanted to explore the doubt, what would he have done if he had the resources that people could have now? Like, if he could listen to the information on this podcast or like see the research that I found for himself, I think it could have helped him. I mean, just to see both sides. I personally have no interest in theology, like the Bible interpretation stuff and like who's right about religion, whatever. Like, would it have made a difference to have proof that John Thomas was a liar? Like, that's not theology of like, oh, I'm going to open up my Bible and prove this or that. But just like, would knowing the history of who he was matter to him? Would having proof that John Thomas was wrong in his prophecies matter to him? Would proof that life continues after death matter to him? He had spent his entire life trying to make everything fit and align with John Thomas's teachings and their views of the Bible. But in this quote, we can see that he did have doubt in John Thomas's beliefs at least once. But he was so indoctrinated that I don't think he had the critical thinking skills and courage to find out the truth for himself. Like, he was smart, but that high intensity of indoctrination and all the psychology that goes around with it, that makes a pretty hard sell around you to get out of. So this quote just makes me sad because it shows that Robert Roberts once had the chance to get rid of John Thomas from his life. He could have enjoyed an authentic life, like a lot of us ex-Christophanians have been trying to do, all these stories you've heard if you've listened to the interview episodes. But then Robert Roberts got sucked back in, and he never got that chance to live his own life away from the control of Dr. Thomas. So I do feel bad for Robert Roberts, like in general, and not just because he had the meanest biographer who recorded all of his flaws for eternity, but because there's mentions of the fact that he was actually a homebody, and especially if he was autistic, he may have struggled with change and new places, so I totally get why he would prefer staying in the same place, having his typical life to ground him and comfort him, to enjoy time with the wife that he loved and respected. But because of John Thomas, he couldn't do that. Because of John Thomas, I believe Robert Roberts lived an inauthentic life. I think he was a people pleaser too, always jumping to do whatever John Thomas wanted so John Thomas would be happy and so his message would be spread. I don't think Robert Roberts ever really asked what he truly wanted. And I don't think he prioritized what would have been best for him, just his health for one thing. I don't think he would have gone on that trip if he had known he wouldn't be able to say his last goodbye to his wife or that he wouldn't be able to die by her side. Again, my opinion. But just after reading about his writings and researching his life so much, I think the indoctrination he experienced was just like what I experienced. I think he was just another victim of the culture and teaching of the Christadelphians. And yes, he had more status and agency and influence than I certainly ever had or had the potential of having. But at what cost? Like, at least I'm able to live a pretty happy, authentic life now and have this control over my life to, a reasonable, healthy degree. And like I said earlier, just reading about this dynamic between John Thomas and Robert Roberts reminds me of the ghost children in Coraline with the other mother, when the other mother ate up their lives. I truly believe that we only get one life. And Robert Roberts essentially sacrificed his to John Thomas. So it just makes me wonder, like, who would Robert Roberts have been if he had never read those Herald magazines when he was 11? Would he have spent more time with his family? Would he have shown more love and acceptance towards his children? Had more love in his life in general? Would he have accepted his son no matter what religion he was in and had a closer connection with him? I would think so. And, I can't say for certain, but I'll end with one last quote. Collier wrote of Roberts that, quote, "He was frequently uncomfortable both physically and mentally, a lover of home so often going away, a lover of peace having to do battle for principle, and a fellow man feeling constrained to choose a course which turns friends into enemies. In a very real sense, he was one who lost his life for the sake of the gospel." I think that's definitely something for us to think about, just even hearing all of our stories, seeing how much we changed and the lessons we learned after leaving the Christadelphians, and now looking back at the people who stayed and what they lost. And it seems pretty clear to me that in most cases, people have so much to gain from leaving. Meanwhile, people can lose their lives by staying. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode of the Life After Leaving podcast. I hope you enjoyed this history episode learning about Robert Roberts. Thanks, everyone, and stay respectable heathens. Now let's take a break for a word from our sponsor. Have your children grown past the age where you can tell them what to believe? Have they started to point out things that don't make sense about your faith? Have they even found compelling ethical violations by your religious community? These are all warning signs that your household is following a dangerous path towards leaving behind forever the archaic laws of a civilization that requires blood sacrifices. But if your greatest wish is to be an obedient servant to an invisible deity, or to indoctrinate your children without their consent, then seek ye first our newest product, Doubt Away Drinks. It's the first ever non-alcoholic beverage that will improve your connection to God by eliminating all those uncomfortable thoughts and emotions. Move over, Kool-Aid, because high control groups have another beverage on the menu. It's time to banish reasoning, critical thinking, empathy, and even unconditional love for your family so that you can focus on the straight and narrow path to whatever future you believe is in store for people who share your narrow worldview and beliefs. Try our full line of exciting flavors today. Doubt Away comes in many chaste flavors, including Eve's Apple, Priestley Pomegranate, Manna Banana, Sword of the Lord Strawberry, Baptismal Blueberry, Don't Pop It Till You're Married Cherry, Preaching Patriarchy Papaya, and Grape Jesus Juice. Say goodbye to Thursday night Bible class and say hello to Thursday night Bible class. We have also released a specialty line of protein drinks featuring Samson's pea protein. You can even pour our grape Jesus juice into your Sunday service goblet so that everyone in your religious circle can drink the Kool-Aid with you and focus on what truly matters, your beliefs in individual salvation, and not this pesky life on earth or the feelings of others. It's time to get rid of those temporary doubts and inconvenient human emotions. Try our blessed line of Doubt Away drinks today. Terms and conditions may apply. Results may vary. Side effects include being cut off by your children, alcoholism, child abuse, unhealthy coping mechanisms, weight gain, an inflated sense of self, isolation, loneliness, never being able to question authority, and never living an authentic life. Never entertain doubt against your religious authorities again with Doubt Away signature drinks. And now, back to the show. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.